Welcome. On behalf of the Inter-University Committee on International Migration, which MIT hosts, and the Working Group on Human Security and the Center for International Studies, welcome. It's a lot of organizations to be co-sponsoring, but it's going to be reflected, I think, in Ananda's talk, these different aspects of international migration, obviously, but also about human security, even though she may not completely realize that's what she's talking about. It's that sort of an academic discourse. I'm John Tierman. I'm executive director of the center. And before I introduce Ananda, I will remind you of some upcoming events. On September 27th, a documentary on Gene Sharp, who you may know as the sort of paladin of nonviolent resistance and change, social change. Am I doing something? That's on September 27th. In 66-110 at 5 o'clock. We're going to have also to be announced, the date to be announced in October, book talk by Darren Acemoglu and James Robinson, I think, the co-authors of Why Nations Fail. On November 13th in Kirsch Auditorium, Attack of the Drones, Ethical, Legal, and Strategic Implications of UAV Use, with Sarah Sewell, Brian Hare, Rabia Mahmood, and moderated by Professor Ken Oy. And on December 6th, writer James Fallows on China. So you can get all this on our calendar at mit.edu/CIS. A good lineup for the fall. I invited Ananda Rose to come speak to us today because I have an interest in immigration, but also she has written a book, which is for sale, by the way, in the back, Showdown in the Sonoran Desert, which is, I think, for books that engage public policy issues, quite unusual. It's unusual in having a very strong moral voice and considering moral issues as they relate to public policy. You know, in international relations, political science, most of the social sciences, we tend to focus on interests of states and rational actor theory and these kinds of things. And morals tend to get shunted to the side if they're considered at all. And Ananda has done quite a remarkable piece of reportage. It's not just a meditation on this problem. She's spoken to many, many people, as I'm sure she's going to tell you about, and yet put this in a context that really asks the most pressing questions about how we treat each other, basically. And so I find it quite an extraordinary piece of work, one that I recommend. And I'm so pleased to introduce her. So help me welcome Ananda Rose.
Thank you. So I have one caveat today. I guess it's more an apology. I'm 38 weeks pregnant, as you can tell. So my brain is not as sharp as it usually is. If I'm not as coherent as I'd like to be, I apologize. I will do my best. So this will be more of an informal talk, and I'm hoping to get some of your questions in 20 minutes or so to engage the issues. So that said, what I wanted to do is speak briefly about the genesis of this book, how it came into existence in the first place, because how a book comes into existence is a story of its own. And then I wanted to talk as briefly as I can on each of the issues that I bring up in the book. And I will try to stick to 20, 25 minutes. So Well, this book started off actually about 5 years ago as a Harvard doctoral dissertation in religion and society. And I was focusing on religion and politics in the Americas, specifically at the U.S.-Mexican border. And originally, I went down to the Tucson sector of Arizona to actually find out what had happened to the main actors in what was known as the sanctuary movement. The sanctuary movement was in the 1980s and a result of the civil wars of Central America, in which we were having a lot of refugees come up from Central America seeking asylum in the United States. So the sanctuary movement began technically in 1979, 1980. There was a particular event in Arizona where I think it was 31 asylum seekers came through Arizona on a very hot day, and half of the people perished trying to seek asylum in the United States and Arizona. And so those who survived were taken into custody, and it was not clear what we should do with these 13 people who survived. So what the United States government wanted to do was send them back to Central America, but they said, no, we're refugees, we're seeking asylum. They invoked the United Nations Convention and Protocol on refugees. And so it wasn't quite clear what was going to happen to these people who were seeking asylum. So a bunch of clergy in the Tucson sector, namely two people, a Presbyterian minister named John Fife, who I will mention in a little bit, came forth, and another Quaker, member of the Quaker organization, named Jim Corbett, who has since deceased. And they came together and they said, look, we have a religious imperative to help the stranger, and invoked many different religious ideas from the Christian scriptures mainly to say, let's aid these people who are seeking help here in the United States. So what happened with the sanctuary movement ultimately is that these two men, along with a whole cadre of people down in the Tucson sector, got together and said, let's have these refugees be, I suppose, harbored in churches and sanctuaries and temples throughout the country. So actually, part of the reason I was interested in the sanctuary movement was as a child, my father was one of these ministers who actually was involved in the sanctuary movement, which involved at least 500 parishes, as I said, temples, synagogues, and the like. And so as a little girl, we had refugees living in our house, and the FBI coming to our house and this sort of thing. And I never knew quite what to make of it. Was this the right thing? Was this not the right thing? So as a little girl, I was asking these very kind of morally muddy questions. Should we be harboring people who are here illegally, but are they seeking asylum, et cetera? So what I wanted to do with this book originally was go down to the Tucson sector and write my doctoral dissertation on the sanctuary movement and what had become of these actors. So John Fife was alive and well, and to find out what had become of the people who had come to my house and lived in my house and lived in these churches and these temples and these synagogues. And so I went down there and I met with John Fife, and it quickly became apparent to me that there was another problem happening, another crisis in Arizona. And this crisis it's similar in that because we have not dealt with our immigration policies properly at the federal level, it's a sort of continuation of that paralysis or that inability to deal with the immigration issue. And what started happening under the Clinton administration, and mostly actually since 9/11, as a result of heightened security at the border, is that migrant deaths skyrocketed. So you had people who were coming in not just from Central America and not seeking refugee status or seeking asylum, but people who were coming here because they had family members who had come, or because they were looking for work or for a better life, to escape violence, the drug trade, etc. So what you had was in the 1990s, you had the Clinton administration began to crack down at the border, and we had, for example, something called Operation Hold the Line in Texas, which bolstered the border down there, adding much more personnel. And then after that, we had similar operations in California, which included walls. And the idea of this was that if we walled off the border, if we added more personnel, if we added more infrastructure, cameras, sensors, everything you can imagine down there, that eventually the illegal immigration flow would stop, because all that was really left were these swaths of desert in Arizona, the Sonoran Desert. So people thought migrants are not going to try to go through this desert. It's 4 days of walking, 5 days of walking in this harsh, horrible, waterless wilderness. So they were wrong. And what began to happen was that so if we have these fact sheets, for example, in the late 90s, there were no migrant deaths recorded, 2 or 3 in 94, 95, 96. But since 1995, there's been a steady stream of migrants who are dying in the desert as a result of this, what's called the funnel effect. So because Texas there's more personnel there, and because California was walled off and focused on, people began coming through this desert, and they began perishing in very high numbers. So you had hundreds of deaths every year. And when I got down to Arizona about 4 or 5 years ago, I quickly realized that it wasn't about the sanctuary movement anymore. It was about these people who were dying. Mothers, fathers, grandfathers, grandmothers, babies, toddlers, people from all walks of life for all different reasons who were trying to come into this country illegally. So what I began doing was then asking, what were people doing about this? Well, it turns out that in Tucson, which is where the sanctuary movement was very active, they were at it again, and they were forming groups of interfaith organizations responding to the migrant death crisis. So what the book does is looks at three of these groups, which I call migrant ministries. They are, for the most part, based on interfaith principles and religious and biblical principles of hospitality. But there are people who are not themselves religious as well. So there are larger moral questions at stake. It's not just about the Bible and tenets from the Bible. So my first group that I really visited was a group called Humane Borders. Humane Borders is a very interesting group. They really started, as soon as the deaths began, they called together groups of people from different churches, different walks of life, and said, what are we going to do about this? People are dying. What is our imperative? What should we be doing? So they brainstormed one solution. It was a very simple solution, one thing, and that was to provide water for migrants in the desert. They wanted their approach to be passive. They didn't want to conflict too much with Border Patrol. So what they did was they began asking for permission from different people, ranchers, parkland, to put out these huge water tanks at strategic places in the desert. And then what they did was they mapped out to see where people were dying. So they came up with a map, and it was clear that people were dying in these corridors, which they began calling corridors of death. And they began putting these water stations out at these corridors to see if that would help diminish the deaths. So this was one strategy, was to do water stations, and it seemed to be very effective. However, the deaths continued. It wasn't quite clear how to stop them, so more organizations got involved. So another famous organization that if you look up online, you'll see lots about is called No More Deaths. Now, No More Deaths took a different approach. They said, we don't really want to be too passive about it. We'd like to be a little bit more active about it. We'd like to challenge the government and to really make it clear to them that these deaths are occurring because of their border strategies. So No More Deaths decided that they were going to do some projects that might be a little bit more confrontational. So they said, let's build a camp in the desert, which they called the Ark of the Covenant, and let's go out from there and let's leave water and food out there, and let's also go try to help some migrants in distress. So they started doing this. They started walking out into the desert and giving people first aid and attending to them, and coming across people who were dying or who had died or who needed medical attention. Now this got a lot of attention with Border Patrol because this looked to Border Patrol and to some of the other agencies like this was aiding and abetting illegal immigration. So what you had was a lot of conflicts going on, and there was a famous case in which 2 of No More Deaths workers found 3 sick migrants on the side of the road, and they decided to pick them up to bring them to Tucson for medical attention. They were very sick, very injured. So on the way to Tucson, they got arrested and ultimately were brought to trial for aiding and abetting and harboring. And it was a very long, protracted trial. In the end, they were released and all charges were dropped, but it was a very contentious, difficult trial. So then No More Deaths said, well, wait a second, humanitarian aid should not be a crime. So they decided that would be their next campaign. Humanitarian aid is not a crime. So they kept going about this sort of strategy. And the next big trouble they got into, and this is when I was down there, was known as the littering trial. And what happened was, there's so many stories down there. When you go down there, all you need to do is start talking to people, especially these folks who work in these interfaith aid organizations, but also Border Patrol agents as well. They come across the wounded and the sick and the dying and the dead all the time, and they have very harrowing stories to tell. So one of these stories was that there was a 14-year-old girl named Jocelyn, and she was coming with her brother to be reunited with her family. And unfortunately, she perished, and they didn't know where she was. So No More Deaths did what they usually do, which is they went out into the desert, and they looked for this little girl. And it took them days and days and days, but one of No More Deaths members found her body up against a tree with her shoes off, and she had perished actually due to the cold. Most migrants actually die due to the heat of the desert, but it was actually a cold winter day in which she died. So they retrieved her body. She was quickly identified. And a few days later, this man who found this little girl decided that he was going to go back to this place and leave water, jugs of water. So he went out and he left jugs of water. But while he was doing it, Border Patrol or some of the refugee with the Buenos Aires wilderness area spotted him and said that they were going to arrest him on the charge of littering. So they did. And he also had to go to court. And meanwhile, another young man named Walt Staten decided, well, this is ridiculous. I'm just going to put some water out there in the same spot. So this is what I mean by active. It was an active sort of approach to this issue. So Walt Staten went out there and left water, and he too was arrested and charged with knowingly littering, which was a different and harsher charge. And once again, a protracted court case, and which was, most charges were dropped in the end, but he did have to do, ironically, 100 hours of community service picking up litter trash. But so No More Deaths went about it this way. The other thing that they did was they set up tents right over in Mexico on the border and shelters over there with approval from the Mexican government. And they set up first aid. So hundreds of people were coming to them in need of aid, water, all sorts of issues. And while this was happening, they would hear these stories about abuse that was going on at the hands, apparently, of Border Patrol agents and in short-term custody. So they started documenting what they thought was abuse and put it into several different reports. So this is getting a bit of attention right now. And their other goal is to try to bring to the public attention why this is happening and the failed policies, border policies and immigration policies at the federal level, paralysis that is occurring at the federal level that is leading to these failed border strategies that is then causing these deaths. So that's sort of what I was looking at. So that was the first half of the book, as I was looking at these interfaith groups who were responding to the death of these migrants. And I just heard so many stories, and I cannot tell you, if you go down there, you just start talking to people and they'll tell you just terrible stories. So what I wanted to do was understand the other side of it. What was the take of law enforcement, Border Patrol, this sort of thing. So I decided to have the second half of the book look at Border Patrol and what their logic was and their rationale to the strategies. So I did a lot of ride-alongs with different Border Patrol agents, and those were fascinating as well. And actually did some campouts with civil militia folks, some of the Minutemen, to see what their ideas on the matter was. The point of what I was trying to do in the book was to really take an ethnographic approach and use stories as a way to get at this issue of migrant deaths and suffering, and to see how the stories might illuminate or elucidate how we might fix this problem as a nation, and also not just as a nation, but as a global community, because immigration, illegal immigration, migration it's a global issue. I think it's something like 215 million people with migrant status at the moment. Maybe that was a few years ago. I think that's like 2 or 3% of the population has some sort of migratory status. So this is an issue that faces everyone right now. So that was the book. In the end, I didn't really my methodology was not to take a point of view or to say that I think that this is the right approach or that's the right approach. I wanted to sort of let all the different voices speak. I think well, this is a quote from the book actually about stories and storytelling and the importance of storytelling. You start talking to people at the border and they start telling you stories. Hearing so many stories strengthened my belief that individual narrative is one of the most compelling and relevant sources of knowledge. Such stories offer a window into the lived experience, lived pain, lived hopes, and lived struggles of others. These issues cannot remain abstract in the face-to-face encounter of such storytelling. By hearing people's struggles firsthand, the entrenched partisan views over how to handle immigration ideally begin to break down. These stories can act as a catalyst to help each one of us, no matter what strong opinions we may hold, move past the black and white divides that plague the current immigration debate. At best, the stories may help us to imagine, if only for a moment, what it is like to be in someone else's shoes. They may help us to think of the problem from a different angle and to help us move beyond the stereotypes so that perhaps, instead of continuing to parrot party lines, everyone can take a small step back and perhaps see the problem in a more nuanced, humanized light. Even if one does not want to let go of one's strongly held opinions, at the very least, by hearing stories from the other side, one's own views can be more truly tested. My aim in these pages has not been to take sides, but rather to try to approach the problem in a disinterested fashion, to try to play a bit of a devil's advocate all around, to see the merits and flaws behind clashing philosophies. So in the end, with this book, I didn't take a firm stance about what we're meant to do. Sometimes I think we're very quick to force solutions, and I think the problem at the border is so complex. I didn't want to take a stand either way, but more to say that this is a very difficult issue. And on that, I would also like to read a little bit at the end here. So part of the reason these migrant deaths are happening is that there's no legislative movement at the federal level. There's just total paralysis. And the only effort that's been made has been to secure the border, to build the fence, which there's about 750 miles of fence now. It's actually quite impressive to see. And it definitely has pushed illegal immigration to an all-time low, or 40-year low. Interestingly, though, there was an article just 2 weeks ago about how migrant deaths per 100 apprehensions is actually higher than ever. So even though illegal immigration numbers are down, per apprehensions, migrant deaths are up. So this problem continues to happen, and every time I call the folks down there, there's another story. You know, like one I heard a month or two ago was about a man, a father from Honduras, and he had lived in Oklahoma for almost a decade. He had an American wife, 2 children, American children, and was in a minor traffic accident, and through secure communities was then deported back to Honduras. But he didn't want to be separated from his family. So he decided to do what a lot of these folks are doing right now, which is risk going through the desert to be reunited with his family in Oklahoma. And very common story, unfortunately. A bad sort of smuggler, 20 other people. They all ran out of water within a day or two, took to drinking dirty cattle water. Half the group got sick, and he was one of the people who got sick and perished on a hill in Tohono O'odham Indian, on the reservation there. So his wife actually called a friend of mine who's actually a Tohono O'odham member to help her find his body. And by some stroke of miracle, they did find his body. But it's just another one of those stories. You just start talking to people, there's always a story. So, you know, we're not really, until we deal at the legislative level, the federal level, immigration reform, then these migrant deaths are going to continue to happen. But people always say to me, well, why can't it just happen? Why not a guest worker program? Why not just pass the legislation? And I say, it's so complicated. So if I could read these last 2 paragraphs, and then I'll open it up to any questions you might have. This is the end of the book. Part of the reason for this lack of legislative movement is that, like the border, immigration is a complicated issue that calls for re-examination. It involves the highly charged questions of how to deal with the millions of undocumented immigrants already here, of how to hold people accountable for coming or staying illegally, while also considering their contributions to the United States, of how to consider the factors that drove them to migrate in the first place, and of how to respect current laws without fracturing family unity. Each of these are deeply moral questions with no clear-cut answers. Making matters worse, all of these questions are connected to even larger and sometimes more abstract historical and psychological forces. Our various understandings of multiculturalism, diversity, patriotism, hospitality, capitalism, neighborliness, global terrorism, and the self-other encounter. It is difficult to see matters clearly with so much going on. Trying to solve the migrant death tragedy is like opening a Russian nesting doll, only to find another one underneath it, and another one after that, and another, seemingly ad infinitum. One can quickly feel overwhelmed or hopeless. And then at the end I say, Unfortunately, at the moment, the U.S. economy is struggling to regain momentum. Unemployment remains high. U.S. debt levels continue to grow. People are rightly concerned about how they will survive in this new humbled America. There are few sectors of the workforce that are not being affected by the tumultuous and grim economic landscape. Thus, we may be tempted to think that trying to reconceptualize the border or trying to reimagine immigration reform simply cannot be a priority at this time. This, in some ways, is quite understandable. Yet it also reflects the short-sightedness that has plagued the immigration debate from the start, limited our conceptions of the border, and led to migrant deaths. After all, ours is a global economy. For better or worse, the economic crisis in the United States is not isolated from matters of immigration, from organized crime, from migration patterns and border politics. They are all interconnected. And then the last paragraph of the book asks the reader this question. Meanwhile, right now, a Border Patrol agent is putting on his uniform for another shift. There is a nun cutting green beans for hungry migrants. There is an aid worker leaving out jugs of water under a mesquite tree. There is a woman and her child sleeping in a shelter in Nogales. There's an old man in a Border Patrol chartered bus being deported to a dark, dusty border town. There is a rancher locking his door in fear. There's a villager in Chiapas who is packing his bags for the journey north. There's a drug smuggler hauling his bundle through the Coronado Mountains. There is someone putting her money into the hands of a coyote, taking her first steps into the Sonoran Desert. And there is you, reading this, asking yourself, what should we do? So those are just some thoughts.
If you have questions, and I hope you do have questions, you want to go to the mics, right? Because this is going to be on Tech TV. We need to record the questions. Mics on either side. And you can just call them people, or just people line up.
Sure.
Thank you. It was an excellent talk. My question is, do you think that opening the border to migration would spur a flood of people trying to get into the country? Is that the fear? And I think that probably the ranchers that live around there might have issues with violence, maybe with people coming through. Some of the people who take advantage of the migrants coming in. But do you think that actually opening the border is going to spur this this flood of people wanting to go in, or do you think that it's just going to bring people in, but then people will be free to come and go as they please? They'll be free to go back to Central America or wherever they come from, as they need to, and that it will just be sort of more a dialogue.
Well, one of the chapters actually is called, it's called Invasions, Floods, and Barbarians, What's to be Afraid of. So the ultimate fear is that, actually, that if we have open borders or our security is not tight enough, that there will be a flood of migrants coming through. At this point, I personally don't think there would be a flood given the economic situation here. I also personally do believe in a good measure of security. I'm not against the border enforcement strategies per se. I think it's important to maintain order, and the chaos at the border is very difficult for those living down there to deal with. The ranchers who you mentioned actually are some of those who are hardest hit in Arizona. Their cattle are often, they chew up the water bottles, they are dying. The ranchers are always afraid of being robbed. There is crime going on. So there needs to be some kind of containment at the border, but I don't believe that they would open it up to a flood. The ideal is that there would be a back and forth, that there would be some kind of operable guest worker program. But this is, again, so much more difficult to say than to actually do. So.
Hi. I wanted to ask you to expand a little bit more on the law enforcement segment of your
Yeah.
story. I think we tend to think in categories and generalizations, and I wondered if in your getting to know the law enforcement people, you noticed any kind of a disconnect or a contradiction in terms of their obligation to fulfill border policies, or did they have any particular personal reaction to the plight of the migrants, and was this any kind of a contradiction for them?
Yeah, and this is where when I talk about storytelling, I think it's very powerful, because a lot of these Border Patrol agents, and it's interesting, about 50% of Border Patrol agents are either Mexican American or have some kind of heritage that derives from Central or South America or Mexico. And talking to Border Patrol, one of the ones that I really talk about here on a particular ride-along that I did, he was born in Mexico, and he came up here, he always says legally, with his mother, but served in the U.S. Army, and then decided to join the Border Patrol after he was given citizenship. And he said he felt very conflicted, because he would come across groups of migrants in the desert, and they would say, don't you feel like you're being disloyal to your people? And he did feel very conflicted about being Mexican American. And he told me this very harrowing story about these two little girls that he found in the desert who had lost their mother and were standing over her body, and he had to watch over them, and he actually ended up naming one of his daughters after one of these little girls. So he felt very conflicted. However, he also believed that the role of law was imperative to a safe and sane border strategy. So there is a lot of personal conflict, I think, in a lot of these agents. I also met another agent at the border while I was taking photographs of the wall, and he was wondering what I was doing there so close to the wall, and I quickly found out I was just this Harvard student doing this project, taking these photos. And then we started talking, and he said, look, before I was a Border Patrol agent, I really had some very stern opinions about illegal immigration, about migrants. I won't tell you what they are, but they were pretty negative. And he said, since I've been in this role and met so many people and realized that most of them are just coming through, struggling to make a better life, my viewpoints I've been humbled, he said. And he didn't want to be specific, but so I think that's a little bit to what you were asking.
Well, you haven't really gotten us any closer to a solution, even though you've restated the problem, albeit eloquently. As I understand it, it's an estimated 2,500 that have perished in the Sonoran Desert. You contrast that with over 11 million illegal aliens that are in this country. That's less than 1/400% of 1%. That have been stopped by the Sonoran Desert. So I don't think that's going to be a very effective deterrent. They still come through mainly in droves that far surpass any that are perishing. But what's happening is that we're finding that immigration reform means essentially amnesty programs. That's become a code word for it. And when you get into amnesty programs, then you're making your own law, essentially. And if you can do it for immigration, then you can do it for virtually any other issue as well. When people take the law into their own hands, then an important principle has been violated and a very negative precedent has been set. But ultimately, since this is a forum on international affairs, we also have to look at unequal economic relations between countries and programs like NAFTA that have helped to create these conditions. And until those are addressed at a higher level, you can't expect American workers to bear the brunt of an influx of illegal aliens that are driving down wages and undermining working conditions. What's happening is that the people at the top continue to make out, and employers are not sanctioned, and the people that are squeezed in the middle are the American working class, and they're not fashionable in a politically correct sense. So they're the ones whose voices are never heard, either in your book or elsewhere. So there are many dimensions to this that are being lost by stories that pull and tug at our emotional heartstrings as well as they should. But there are cold, hard facts of loss in other dimensions that aren't captured in these stories.
Right, and I do actually talk about that. And when I talk about the fear that people have of illegal immigration, there is a lot of concern about about our jobs being taken away. About there is certainly a cost to medical, the taxpayers paying for example, hospitals in the Tucson sector have almost had to close because they've been paying for these migrants who get brought into them and are so sick, or they're near death, or they're so they've had to almost close down certain hospitals. Schools are having to, pay for. That's one of the arguments. So
environment as well. There's environmental implications that aren't addressed properly.
Right.
Rising birth rates and everything else. It's
And the other thing is that, I'm not a legal expert, but it gets into these sort of nuances of the law. What is, we need the law to keep, philosophically speaking, we need the law to keep us all in order. So we have a right and a wrong, and we all behave in a civilized manner. But what is the law? I mean, if we're driving 65 miles per hour in a 50 mile per hour zone, are we breaking the law? Is there any comparison that can be made? So philosophically speaking, the complexities of the role of the law in this issue are, again, very muddy.
Thanks, Amanda. This was very insightful. I wanted to raise 2 points. One is, which we have discussed in the Inter-University Committee on International Migration study, on all these women who are left behind and their husbands or brothers are here on seasonal working permits, and that puts them at risk. Did you see anything that you had in these groups, more female than male? So that's one question. But the other is more a comparative question, because we from the UN High Commissioner for Refugees have counted about 2,000 deaths in the Mediterranean. Mm-hmm. And it's really a quite dramatic situation which the European Union is trying to tackle with both at the southern border and at the eastern borders. And it was in 2004 that the Union decided to establish Frontex, which is the EU External Border Agency, which has now a budget which goes into the millions and millions. And they are operating with a staff of 800, but then bring in border guards and police officers from the member states. And they are patrolling with planes and boats in the Mediterranean and in Greece. So I was wondering whether you had a chance to perhaps take a little bit of a comparative perspective and see the European Union has come up with the joint return operations, and every year more people are being returned, and that's of course a point of contention because the principle of non-refoulement is being flagrantly violated every day by governmental agencies in the European Union, and people are dying on the borders of the European Union, not just in the Mediterranean, but also in the Ukrainian and eastern border. So what insights did you bring with your studies there? That would be interesting. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Well, I'll get to the second question first, which is that originally I wanted the project to do a comparison between what you're talking about, the European Union and the issues there and the U.S.-Mexico border. But I realized that was just too much to tackle. That's another book. So that's a book in waiting. However, I did make a lot of contact with some particular interfaith coalitions in Malta that were doing very similar work to what No More Deaths and Humane Borders was doing. So in my introduction, this is just to reiterate your words, but in the introduction I say, well, the Tucson sector serves as the epicenter of my research. The issue is relevant far beyond the dusty, cactus-strewn confines of Arizona. Places like Malta, Italy, and Spain, and many other places, as you say, are reeling with a similar ethical quandary. In recent years, these southern European countries have seen thousands of illegal immigrants from Africa turn up on their shores. These are immigrants who have risked their lives to cross the sea in rickety boats, as hundreds more perish trying to, in search of better lives. With the recent and continuing political upheaval in North Africa, there will certainly be more migrants undertaking this perilous journey, forcing the citizens of little rocky Mediterranean islands, such as Lampedusa or Malta, to continue to ask themselves eerily similar questions. How do we respond to the stranger at the door, of whom we know nothing, the totally other? While law enforcement under the jurisdiction of the European Union has been setting up detention camps and other controversial legal mechanisms to deal with the influx in recent years, religious coalitions have been mobilizing to provide the same sort of radical hospitality to African migrants that many Tucsonans have been giving to Latin American migrants thousands of miles away. So to the specifics, I can't speak, because again, I'm not a legal expert, but I think the comparison is very, very apt. And to the gender question that, that you ask, I would have to say that certainly women do suffer the most. And the stories that one hears about the rape and abuse that women suffer at the hands of their smugglers is really just some of the worst stories I've ever heard. And you hear them in the shelters. Women will tell them to you. Border Patrol agents who pick up these women who are in these horrible conditions will tell you the stories. And it's well known that women actually begin to take birth control before they even set out on the journey, because they know it's not like as one of the people I talked to down at one of the No More Deaths. It's not if they will be raped, it's when, which is to rephrase what one of the people I talked to lately said. So.
John, you permit just one additional point. It's not probably very illuminating for the situation in America, but there was the first case at the European Court on Human Rights of Strasbourg this February 2012, where Italy was found having violated the European Convention on Human Rights, Article 3, notably inhuman treatment and torture. And the fact was that the boat came into Lampedusa, and the Italian Navy forced a number of Somalis, Eritreans onto the boat, and under an agreement signed by Berlusconi and Gaddafi, shipped them over to Libya, where they were sitting under the sun, and some of them perished. But some managed then to come back, and then brought eventually a case to Strasbourg. It's a new ballgame now that a state has been found of violating the European Convention on Human Rights. Whether it does anything in practice, we will have to see. But this is something which, at least for the human rights and refugee movement in Europe, is giving a little bit of hope that we are not totally alone, and that the refugees might get some support eventually. But the problem is that it's really a mixed migration flow. It's not obligatory all persons fleeing in need of protection, and that makes it so difficult. It makes it a very difficult negotiation, both for the UN High Commissioner for Refugees as well as other organizations. So here we are on a new threshold.
Exactly. Great.
I wonder if you could expand a little bit on your experience with some of the vigilante groups in the following manner. There have been, lots of arguments against allowing or being permissive about illegal immigration, and the earlier questioner had, I guess, the well-articulated list. I think many of those things, things about jobs and the cost to hospitals and schools and so on, I think are contestable. There have been lots of economic studies now of this, and it's a pretty marginal effect. But I wonder if the opposition, the active opposition in places like Arizona, doesn't derive from things other than those kinds of arguments, the arguments about the costs to the United States, and center much more on identity politics. It strikes me that, especially in the Tucson school curriculum controversy going on now, in which you can explain it probably better than I can, but Chicano studies in high schools has basically been thrown out by the state superintendent. And this was a vehicle for Mexican-American children, legal Mexican-American children, to do better in school and go on to college. It just strikes me as pure identity politics. We don't want to acknowledge, those of us who are European origin don't want to acknowledge that the country is changing in some dramatic ways. The same issue in Europe, but in Europe it comes from a different faith tradition and so on. I mean, in some ways it's more dramatic in Europe than it is in the United States, but it's still an identity issue. So I wonder if you could, well, what's sort of your reporting lead you to?
Well, yeah, in the chapter on the Border Patrol and on the vigilantes, I mentioned fear. Well, I talk about fear as a major factor behind border enforcement policies. And when I talk about fear, I sort of came up with my own categories from spending a fair amount of time, actually specifically mostly with the civil militia groups. And so there was fear of criminal elements, terrorism, or 9/11, right here today. And also just criminal elements, meaning the Border Patrol loves to give out statistics like 12% of people apprehended in 2008, 2009 had a criminal record, or 35% this year had a criminal record, meaning they could have possessed marijuana, or they could have had charges of rape again, any kind of these we don't want these bad people in our country. So there's that fear of criminal elements, which on a day like today makes a lot of sense to all of us. The second sort of fear factor were the domestic concerns that were very well articulated, that illegal immigrants are taking our jobs, we can't even get them ourselves, they deplete taxpayer-run institutions, drain public funds, the hospitals, schools, these sort of things. And the third sort of fear factor that I came up with that I elaborate in the book, which I personally found sort of most fascinating and most elusive, it's hard to pin down, was the fear that there's some sort of threat to some perceived American way of life. And that's where in the end I mention there's all these factors, abstract and not so abstract. But one of these factors is multiculturalism, diversity, how the demographics of this country are shifting. They've shifted, they're shifting. And that there's some level of fear or apprehension about this change. So in the book I talk at length, and I found very fascinating actually, Pat Buchanan's book, for example, State of Emergency, the Third World Invasion and Conquest of America. I read that. I found it fascinating, so I go into that. But the title itself says it, State of Emergency, Third World Invasion and Conquest of America. And the other book that I found very fascinating was Samuel Huntington's, and this gets to your question, who are we? The challenges to America's national identity. And in that book, he argues very articulately that the salience and substance of this America's so-called Anglo-Protestant culture is being challenged by this new wave of immigrants. And that this new wave of immigration over the last 20, 30 years it's different than former waves of immigration because it's mostly from Central South America, Spanish-speaking, et cetera, et cetera. So that somehow we're losing our way of life as Americans and these Anglo-Protestant values. So I do believe, if you ask, I really couldn't get most of the civil patrol folks down there will say, we're not racist, we have people from all different places, amongst us. So I really couldn't get anyone to say that was what they were afraid of. But I do feel like there's definitely that fear going on.
My question, I think, overlaps with John's question just now, but I wanted to pick up on something you talked about early in the presentation, which was your interest in the three religiously motivated groups who might not all be from the same sect, from the same religion, but who saw religion as a driving force in coming forward to help the people who were trying to cross the Sonoran Desert, losing their lives. What I wanted to ask you about is the extent to which you saw and heard religion being used as a justification and motivation also by opponents of the migration and opponents of those groups in particular. And I wondered if you could expand on that a bit.
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, I didn't really get to speak about the sort of religious elements specifically, but that's actually my expertise. I always say you have to be careful of cherry picking or proof texting out of the Bible, which means you pick a piece of biblical passage out of context and use it for your own ideologies. So this is happening on all sides. This is happening with No More Deaths, and it's also happening with the civil militia folks. And yes, there's definitely a whole bunch of passages in the Bible. In particular, there's the passage from Romans 13, and it's, Romans 13 says the law is a gift from God, and authority is divinely ordained, so we all have to obey the law. Now this Romans 13 is what they mostly go to. Whereas I will say that those who sort of advocate for radical hospitality or biblical hospitality, their argument is far outweighed in the Bible. There's only a few passages that these folks, these civil militia folks, can go to, but they're there. They're definitely there. And it's interesting. But from the point of view of the other side, the radical hospitality, biblical hospitality, there are just so many passages that they cite from Genesis that all people are created equal in the image of God, and since we're all equal, we should all be treated equally, etc. And then, of course, the Levitical injunctions to love your neighbor as yourself that are picked up later in the teachings of Jesus. The injunctions to help and show compassion to the least of these, and of course all the stories in the Bible about forced migration and exile and uprootedness. So I will have to say that there are far more passages in the Bible that sort of support the No More Deaths, Humane Borders, radical hospitality folks, but there are also those that say, the law comes first. It's ordained by God. We have to obey the law. The law comes first, and then compassion second. But cherry picking.
Thank you, Ananda. I must say the methodology is just so engaging. It's fantastic. I come from Ireland, and about 4 or 5 years ago, and we reckoned there were 150 different languages spoken in the homes of our children, and 10% of our population had not been born in the island of Ireland. Now that was at the height of the Celtic Tiger. As the economy dropped, open borders, Eastern Europe, Greece, North Africa, took care of the fact that there weren't as many jobs available. So there actually was very little tension between those who did and those who didn't have. And I think at the height of it, we recognised we couldn't have run the country or the boom without them. To be fair to Bush, he did recognise that a lot of the reason why Americans were getting things so cheaply was because a lot of the labour was actually immigrant labour who were prepared to work for very little. What are the figures now in terms of, do people on the border realise that in fact a lot of the way of life is actually because there are so many illegal immigrants working throughout the rest of the United States, or do we have figures on that? Is there really a tension in terms of immigrants taking jobs?
I think there are different figures for different questions from different people who all want to support. It's a different kind of cherry picking. But the paradox, what was so interesting down there is, the paradox of having sort of open borders for goods and trade, but closed borders for labor was very mind-boggling. And these issues of cheap labor and are we actually gaining from the cheap labor? What are the contributions of immigrants to our country, to all of our countries, to Ireland, etc.? I think some folks, like the civil militia folks who are on that side, some who advocate a very sort of staunch law enforcement attitude, I think they don't really, that's not part of their argument, is to think about, well, yes, so there's this illegal immigration going on, and they're taking our jobs, and we should be, we should be having our own jobs. Americans should be getting their own jobs. They're taking them away from us. I think that often overlooked, though, is these wonderful contributions and how, if we took away the estimated 11 million, 12 million undocumented folks who are here, what would happen to our economy? I would think it would crumble, but that's me personally. I think it's a really integral part of our economy.
Thank you very much for your presentation and for the tremendous work that you have done. I have two questions. The first one is, are you planning to send a copy of your book to Mr. Romney and Mr. Obama and ask them for their opinion? And the second question is about this problem of migration all over the world. Is there any consideration anywhere in the world where the human rights would be implemented?
Well, to the Romney and Obama question, I find this race fascinating, and I could go on at length, which I won't, about my take on what their take is on immigration, and Obama's recent executive order and the DREAM Act and this and that. Yes, I would love to send a copy to them, to see what they have to say. But as for the problem of migration, and actually John might be able to talk to this more coherently, since you really work right on human rights and issues of immigration. Since I don't work on a global context, I can't think of a particular country that sets a particular example for human rights that comes to mind. Do you? Anybody else here have?
I can just speak for the European Union. I know the Commissioner for Home Affairs, Cecilia Malmström. She has just been here in April, May in Harvard, and we had a quite in-depth conversation where she was talking about the challenges, not just to make Frontex respect human rights and refugees, but to further develop a European Union migration policy which goes along basic human rights norms. And the problem is the member states. One thing is that the Commission draws up a plan, and another is then that it's not just getting endorsed by member states, which then perhaps nolens volens might do for some expected benefits, but the implementation is the cue. And that happens on the borders, in the prisons, and I have just seen it over the summer. I'm a member of the Council of Refugees in my country, in Germany. How many violations we have, how many deportations, and they start at midnight when people are being picked up from their homes because they have not been found qualifying for refugee status, and they're being sent back. I don't want to leave everyone in such a desperate situation, but it is a very difficult situation to have a migration policy and a refugee policy which respects human rights. And after all, refugees are human rights violations made visible, and the migrants many times move on for many of the same reasons without having them qualified in a legal manner often. So I think there is, to put a positive spin on it, I think there is some progress that the human rights community in the last 60 or now 65 years, 2013 of the Universal Convention on Human Rights and the now 9 UN Convention on Human Rights, look at the Disability Convention. Those member states which have ratified them, you can go to court and claim the rights, and it becomes very practical at the national level. But again, to make rights work, it's the implementation which matters. And it's the money which has to be behind it, and both of them are really still very much lagging behind.
Hi, thank you very much for your presentation. I was just wondering if you found that the strengthening of the border controls led to a change in the traditional crossing patterns, and how this is related to the rise of the number of deaths.
I think it's directly related, and I think that's what all the groups have tried to show quite successfully, which is that That's what's referred to as the funnel effect. So Texas and California were literally closed off, which created this funnel pattern. And so as a result of, I think that the border enforcement strategies has been actually very successful. Not only, illegal immigration is down, not only because of the economy, although I think that's a huge factor, not only because of deportations and sort of secure communities and these sort of programs, but because it's worked. I mean, I feel like the border strategy has made it so difficult and so dangerous for people to come over that you have to be, at this point, you have to be at a level of desperation that's even another level up. So actually at this point, when I started the project, when people were coming in at record highs, 5 or 6 years ago, it was for all reasons. It was really to find jobs, everything in between. But now, I would say the majority of people who are coming across actually are people who have been deported, who want to be reunited with family. So it's actually a lot of family reunification, which gets to the question of human rights. And what are we meant to do about this? So that's what I find now. And those people who want to be reunited with their daughter or their son or their baby or their wife or all of the above or their mother, they will do almost anything to come through. And that's where I find the stories very tragic at the moment that I hear. Even though there's less people coming through, the stories are getting more dramatic. To the lengths that they're willing to go through to be back with their family. So,
I wanted to ask if I could be permitted another question or make a comment that a lot of the people who are coming through are actually a high percentage of indigenous Americans, and that we are the colonists, and I think it would help if we understood that even though a lot of them are from the South, they're still indigenous people. They're indigenous to the country. And they're not alien, they're not illegal. Before Europeans colonized and set borders, there was, I'm sure, more fluid travel. And that we ought to take that into consideration is indigenous, actually, values, and I'm sure there's division within that community too. But I think that these people are indigenous, and there are indigenous people here, and most of the people in this room are probably immigrants.
Right, and I've done a lot of work actually with folks from the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is the second largest Native American reservation in the United States. It's the size of Connecticut, and it happens to be 72 miles of it along the U.S.-Mexico border. So when we talk about human rights again, when you get to the question of Native Americans and indigenous sovereignty, not only are we, that is just a whole other question, which if I had had more time to write more, I would have written another chapter actually and added that into here, because that is so important, the way that Native Americans in this country, their rights are in question over this issue, and also Native American or indigenous folks who are coming up from Mexico, from southern Mexico, from different areas of the country, these countries. In fact, when you go, so part of this border crackdown has been to have what's called these mass trials. Essentially, you have these mass trials in Tucson, known as part of Operation Streamline. And what you have is about 70 or 80 folks who've been detained at a time, chained together. It's amazing that this happens in this country. The first time I saw it, I couldn't believe it. So you go to the Tucson courthouse, and you have 70 men shackled together and 8 or 9 women shackled together in a different section. And several of these people who, in these 1-second trials, are you guilty or not guilty, and they have interpreters. And a lot of the people who are on trial in these fast-track trials don't even speak Spanish. Actually, they speak a whole range of indigenous languages, so they have to get interpreters. So that's a whole other issue that muddies the waters as well. So.
Quite shocking. I had a question about the border guards and their relationship to violence, and whether you heard a lot of stories of them also being drawn in to violent actions because they're a little bit outside the law, they're not so visible, and what is the morality of that problem? Also, I'd be curious what the Tohono I'm sorry.
Tohono O'odham, yeah.
Tohono O'odham action. Did they take action on the people in their desert, or did they try to remain neutral because of their precarious position? That, I realize, is another whole story I'd like to ask about.
Yeah, that's second. But to the first one, I can't actually, everybody has different opinions about that first question about our Border Patrol agents. Are they violent? Are they abusive? Are they drawn to this particular role? So No More Deaths put out two reports that you might be interested in. It gets really at the human rights violations of short-term detention. So when people are taken into detention, they're there for about 72 hours while they figure out who they are and where they should go, if they should stay, if they can stay, etc. And during the 72 hours, what No More Deaths has found, so what happens is these people go to these mass trials in shackles in the clothes that they've been wearing for 3 days, and then they get deported en masse in the middle of the night or some other, anytime. It can be anytime, it can be anywhere. If they were picked up in Tucson, they can deport them over in Texas so that they don't supposedly hook up with their same smugglers. This is also an issue. But they get deported in hundreds of them at a time, and that's why No More Deaths has set up these shelters and kitchens right over the border. And so what they started doing was hearing these stories from all these people, thousands and thousands and thousands of stories in which these migrants were claiming to have been abused, everything from being hit to verbally, being abused, to having their possessions confiscated, to having lewd gestures. There's a whole catalog. I think they put it into 12 different categories. And the latest report they put out, I think, is called A Culture of Cruelty. You can find it online. They would claim that, yes, the Border Patrol has been very abusive. Not everybody, but that is a culture of cruelty. I didn't see that personally, but I'm sure there are definitely the exceptions. I'm sure it's probably true. There's been a lot of condemnation of particular Border Patrol agents.
And what about the Tohono O'odham?
Oh gosh, and the Tohono O'odham, that is a whole. If you want to find out more about them, you should look up this really interesting fellow named Mike Wilson. He has his own. So because the Tohono O'odham Nation it's such a complicated question. But because they're trying to maintain their own sovereignty, they have decided that they don't want humane borders to put any water stations on their land. And unfortunately, the Tohono O'odham Nation, as I said, it's 72 miles along the border. This is where most people are going, and this is where over 50% of migrants are dying. They're actually dying on this reservation, which Humane Borders has been banned from putting water. So this has become a whole political story, and there are certain members, tribal members, who have gone against the tribal council's ruling about this and have gone out and put out their own tanks. Mike Wilson is one, David Garcia is another. You can find their stories, I'm sure, on the internet. And they've been putting out their tanks out there, and the tanks have been vandalized. They put them out again. Because they are Tohono O'odham, they actually can go into Mexico, because also it's not just the U.S. Tohono O'odham Nation extends well into Mexico, so they can put tanks in Mexico. But it's been the tribe has been divided over this issue, and it's a very sad situation, actually. Yeah, and
I don't know much about the security of the borders in the other direction, and maybe you can say something about that and all these dollars and energies. What did you see of folks trying to make things less horrific on the other side, such that people would rather risk death in order to go? And the families, as you described, doesn't seem like people are making the same sacrifice to go in the other direction. And so I'm wondering what sort of boundary there is and what sort of energies you saw towards decreasing the incentive to leave.
You mean people going from the U.S. back to Mexico? And what was the question exactly?
What is the status of that border? How penetrable is it? And has there been comparable or any energy that you've seen? I mean, you have people willing to die or give their lives to get the water to these folks. Have you seen that kind of passion and energy devoted to making those places less horrific, such that people would make those huge risks to leave?
Well, in terms of folks going back, there's no danger in going back. I don't know if I understand the question quite.
Other opportunities if they go back? Is anybody working on opportunities for them if they go back to make life better?
Oh.
Yes, is the return, is that what you mean?
No, I just mean, obviously people are making these huge risks because it's so horrific.
Yeah.
Right.
They're living. So people giving energy to help the transitions with the water. Has she seen people devoted to...
Right, to helping them to reintegrate back into life, you mean?
Or not even back, but to help make the situation less horrific, such that people would take those risks to leave.
I don't quite...
Maybe I'm just thinking that maybe the migrant houses, maybe, I don't know if what you mean is what people do, for instance, in Mexico, in specific territories where people are crossing. I'm from a state border in Mexico, and there's a really big house that is a migrant house in Coahuila. So what they are doing is that they basically help all people has been telling other people that there's this like refugee. So before crossing the border, they stop over there, and at least they get prepared to do it. I mean, they give them food, they give them a shelter. Is that what you mean?
Why do they want to leave?
Why?
Is anyone working on that problem?
Lots of people.
Hi, thank you very much. I'm a philosopher here at MIT. And so a number of times you've talked about the muddy ethical questions. And I guess what I'm looking for is some help in understanding where you, I mean, ethical questions are never easy, but where you think the muddy ones are. Because it seems to me that, civil disobedience, that is, we are morally obligated to break an unjust law. We're morally obligated to try to help those in need. I mean, there doesn't seem to be a lot of, and we're also morally obligated to enforce a just law. And so then there's the question, well, are the laws just or not? And it seems to me that there are a lot of questions. So this kind of connects to the issue that a lot of the ethical questions seem to me pretty clear. It's the implementation of them that's very difficult, and it's gaining knowledge about what's actually the facts so that we can adjudicate whether there's just or not just. But I think I'm also missing some stuff, and I'm just interested if you could help me articulate very clearly where you think is the ethical challenge that we don't have any answer to, that we're just stuck with. That makes sense.
I will try, but do you have, since you teach philosophy, I'm curious if
my inclination is to think, well, we know that rape is wrong, we know that abuse is wrong, we know that some of the stuff that's happening with the chain, with the shackles is wrong, we know that the certain kinds of detention without access to, all that is clear. We know that those are all wrong. We know that there are a lot of deportations that are immoral and unjust. We know that, so there's a lot of there that's pretty clear. I don't know the facts. I don't know all the facts, but some of the things that are reported we know are morally wrong, right? And we know that we ought to try to if we're going to be moral people, try to do things to prevent, these immoral things from happening. Screw the law. The law is not necessarily a moral thing, but then there are also just laws.
Right.
And so we've got to, and so there's information that we need about what's actually happening. There's information about the laws. But I'm not quite sure yet I see the muddiness of the ethical question. I see the muddiness of implementation and the muddiness of the understanding of facts and the muddiness of all that, but I'm not quite sure I see the muddiness of the ethical question.
Well, it's funny. I don't know, even the question about is shackling immoral? I'm sure some people would say it's perfectly moral, or some of these things that maybe you think is immoral, and maybe other folks don't even think is
Yeah, but I don't think that people, I mean, I think that we have a very impoverished moral discourse in this country,
right.
and that a lot of it rests on religion, and I think religion is a very bad source of, moral insight myself.
Right.
And there are people who develop ethical frameworks or try to, secular ethical frameworks. So I'm not complaining to you.
Yeah.
I'm complaining
no,
about
I understand
the level of ethical discourse is really
right.
deeply impoverished.
Right. I would agree.
And I don't think that I have the answers to everything,
right.
but I'm interested because I would like to think about the ethical. I'd like to learn about some of the ethical questions so I could think harder about them.
I know, I would too. I do, and I understand.
So I'm not saying I know everything. I'm just saying how I want to.
Yeah, no, and the reason, religion is so. I myself actually am not Christian. I'm more of a sort of secular humanist type myself, so I have that desire as well that you express. But in this country, I think the latest Pew Research, number was 78% of people in this country, or some huge number, identify as being Christian. So the Christian story for them is so fundamental in their ethical formation. So when you get to a place down like at the border where so many people use this Judeo-Christian narrative to structure their ethical reasoning around: do we shackle, do we not shackle? What's just, what's unjust? That's how I got into the religion aspect of it. I myself would like you to see a larger, more secular framework personally. But I agree. I can't offer it. I wish I could.
But I mean, I think the answer, you gave the answer to Sally's question. I think that the numbers question: what is the moral number of people we should let into the country, right? And the question of if people.
I'm never going to give you a number.
But I think the moral obligations of a nation to balance those already in the country and those who want to come in the country, given the extreme poverty in Mexico, which is of such huge. I think that's a moral conundrum, right? That's not solved.
I'm curious what you do with someone like, civil disobedience and someone like Martin Luther King Jr., who sort of incorporates these religious narratives, but also incorporates some more secular narratives and blends them together to say, look, we must challenge these unjust laws. Is that?
I think to depend on morality to take us where we need to go is probably putting too much of a weight upon it. One of the things I've thought of was, could we not just set some time in the future, maybe 50 years hence, in which we would have open borders, and giving ourselves a preparation time, because of course our colleague over here raised the question, is why is immigration so difficult? Why are so many coming one way and not the other? And of course the reality is the development of the world is just so unjust and so uneven. And unless we can actually work at that, seriously work at that, I mean, most people actually probably want to stay in Mexico or Guatemala.
Yes.
They don't want to come. I mean, you even talk to African Americans here who want to go back to the South. This whole question of home is very, very important.
Yes.
And I do think, I mean, Europe, to be fair to it, actually did set that kind of 3 or 4 decades hence. And within that time, people like Ireland and Portugal and Spain actually had to get their act together. The fact that Goldman Sachs rigged the figures for Greece was a real problem. But by and large, there was a real preparation done on all of those countries so that we wouldn't have the problem in terms of immigration. And by and large, it tended to work. So my sense is we can't just work on the border issue without also recognizing that we do need to work in a very unequal world in which immigration is going to continue to be a problem until in some way that is rebalanced.
Yeah. And I think philosophically speaking, the question of open borders, I actually write about, I sort of diverge a little bit in the book away from religion. I don't really work on the secular moral frameworks because I struggle to find them myself. But I do sort of go to the existentialists who, on a very core level, one can disagree with this, of course. There is just a very simple fear of others and the boundaries of our bodies and of our countries and of our houses and of our yards. We all want to feel protected, and there's my space and there's your space. So the question of open borders can be such an abstract, difficult. I don't know if it will ever be a human thing to have open borders, to have open bodies, to have open yards and open spaces. I think it's just I think the self-other encounter, which is something that I talk about briefly in here as a sort of divergence, is really fundamental.
Well, I'm afraid that's all the time we have. That was a very good discussion, and I just do want to remind you of the upcoming events again, which I have, because some of you came in late. Yes, the border cross. So this is border crossing, citizenship, race, and gender, October 12th, 13th, in Building 32, D461. Two-day, very interesting.
I have some more flyers if people want.
Flyers there. I'm giving opening remarks, so that should draw a big crowd. Documentary on Gene Sharp, September 27th, in Building 66, is the next one for CIS. Okay, thank you so much. See you next time.